Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. Today, we are undertaking a systems-level institutional analysis of a massive, invisible architecture that sits quietly in the background of your everyday life.
It really is everywhere once you know what to look for.
Exactly. And we have a fascinating stack of source material today, centered around the research compiled in the book The Spirit Level, Why Greater Equality Makes Society Stronger by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. We're also drawing heavily on an incredibly insightful foreword by Robert B. Reich. But I want to make something perfectly clear right out of the gate for you, the listener. This is not a book review.
No, absolutely not. We are not here to offer a literary critique or to summarize chapters for you. In this kind of systems analysis, books are simply entry points.
Right.
They are lenses that provide us with the data necessary to diagnose structural realities. We are looking at identity as a product of systems. And the primary system we are going to diagnose in this deep dive is the inequality hierarchy system.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you hear a phrase like inequality hierarchy system, it sounds like thick academic jargon. But what we are actually talking about here is a social ranking environment.
Yes.
We want to understand how large income gaps do not just passively create a demographic of rich people and a demographic of poor people. That is just the surface level illusion. Instead, these massive gaps fundamentally engineer a highly active, high-stakes competition for status.
It's a living system. It shapes institutional behavior, it rewires our biology, and it produces entirely predictable health and social outcomes across an entire society.
So if we're going to look at the design of this system, like how it is actually built and how it functions, we have to start by fundamentally redefining what we mean when we use the word poverty. Because our conventional understanding is completely outdated.
It is, and that outdated view blinds us to how the system actually operates today.
Right, like if I stop someone on the street and ask them to define poverty, they're going to talk about absolute scarcity, starvation, homelessness, the total lack of material goods.
And honestly, for most of human history, that was an entirely accurate definition. But the sources point us to this brilliant paradigm-shifting quote from the anthropologist Marshall Solins. He wrote, "Poverty is not a certain small amount of goods. It is a relation between people. Poverty is a social status."
It is a relation between people that completely flips the script.
Exactly. What Solins is pointing to is the transition from absolute deprivation to what we can call structural distance. In modern, wealthy nations, the nature of deprivation has fundamentally changed.
The data in our sources really hammers this home. They point out that in the United States, for example, if you look at the demographic officially classified as living in poverty, the material reality does not match that historical definition of absolute scarcity.
Not at all.
About 80% of these households have air conditioning. Almost 75% own at least one car or truck. Around a third have a computer, a microwave, or a second car.
So if someone has a car, a microwave, and air conditioning, a lot of people would argue, well, they aren't really poor. They have their basic needs met. What are they complaining about?
Yeah, that's the classic devil's advocate response. Why does inequality matter if the absolute baseline of material goods is relatively high?
But that is the exact trap of the conventional definition. If you only look through the lens of absolute material survival, you miss the psychological and physiological crushing weight of the hierarchy.
Because if you have an air conditioner, but you still experience the profound, debilitating stress of poverty, what is actually causing that trauma? It's not the temperature of your living room.
No, it's the structural distance between you and the top. The issue is that large wealth gaps convert everyday life into an endless evaluation environment.
An evaluation environment. That is a terrifying phrase when you really think about it. It means you are never off the clock.
You never are. When you live in a society with massive distances between the top and the bottom, you are forced to constantly infer your worth, your physical safety, and your sense of belonging from your relative position.
And human beings are evolutionary hypersocial creatures. We do not just want to survive. We need to know where we stand in the tribe.
The 19th century philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson observed this perfectly way before we had the sociological data to back it up. He wrote, "'Tis very certain that each man carries in his eye the exact indication of his rank in the immense scale of men, and we are always learning to read it."
I mean, it is a beautiful articulation of a very harsh reality. What Emerson observed poetically, modern psychology now confirms empirically.
Completely. Psychological experiments demonstrate that we judge a stranger's social status within the first few seconds of meeting them. We look at their shoes, their dental work, the cut of their clothes.
Their posture. Their vocabulary, we are always scanning, always evaluating, always trying to read that indication of rank.
And when the hierarchy is extremely steep, when the consequences of being at the bottom are socially devastating, that radar is running on overdrive.
It shifts the entire nature of how we interact with each other. If I live in a relatively equal society, a stranger's just a stranger, maybe a neighbor, a peer.
But in a highly unequal society, interacting with strangers turns from a cooperative relation into a comparative one.
That is a critical distinction. The relationship fundamentally changes. You are no longer interacting with someone as an equal citizen. You are sizing them up, and they are sizing you up. Identity itself becomes an open question that has to be endlessly defended.
And it is not just individual interactions. Our macro institutions adapt to this hierarchy as well. Workplaces, schools, policing, media, and consumer culture, they all mutate into status sorting machines.
They become mechanisms for figuring out who belongs where on the ladder. Which brings us to the incentives. Why do we participate in this? If it's so stressful to constantly evaluate and be evaluated, why do actors behave this way within the system? Let's map out the incentives at the individual layer first. Why do we care so deeply about our rank?
We look at what psychologists call the lock and key effect. Human psychology and societal inequality fit together in a way that generates highly predictable behavior. Individuals are overwhelmingly incentivized to reduce what is known as social pain.
Right, the researchers Dickerson and Kameny.
Yes, they synthesized hundreds of studies and coined the concept of social evaluative threat.
Social evaluative threat, meaning the threat isn't a tiger in the bushes, the threat is looking bad in front of the tribe.
Precisely. It is the acute stress we feel when our self-esteem, which is inextricably linked to others' perceptions of our worth, is threatened. In a steep hierarchy, being at the bottom carries an immense social stigma. It signals that you are less competent, less valuable, less worthy of respect.
So individuals are incentivized to desperately seek status markers, to create distance from that stigma. We seek affiliation with the top and distance from the bottom to avoid the shame of being seen as second class.
The shame is the driver.
Hmm.
There is a specific anecdote in the source material that really hammered this home. They mention a young, unemployed man living in a deprived area who spent essentially an entire month's income on a brand new, high-end mobile phone.
Now, purely economically, that makes absolutely zero sense. You'd look at that and say, what terrible financial literacy.
But when researchers asked him why he did it, he said it was because girls ignored people who didn't have the right stuff. Without that phone, he felt completely invisible. He felt like he had no human value.
And that completely reframes how we view consumerism. We often moralize consumerism as simple greed or vanity or just a lack of discipline. But in a highly unequal environment, consumerism functions as a defensive signaling layer.
It's armor.
Yes, exactly. It is a defensive display in a society where rank feels profoundly consequential.
Over a century ago, the economist Thorstein Veblen coined the term conspicuous consumption. More recently, Robert Frank talks about luxury fever. The neurotic need to shop, to upgrade your car when your current one works perfectly fine, to wear a specific logo. This is actually a reflection of how deeply vulnerable and social we are.
It is an attempt to manage the impressions we make and defend ourselves against social evaluative threat. And obviously, firms and advertisers know this. They are the next layer of the incentive map. They completely monetize this insecurity.
They do. They aren't just selling you a car to get from point A to point B. They are selling you a symbolic upgrade. They are selling you relief from the anxiety of being perceived as low status.
They sell identity products.
Yeah.
But the incentives driving this hierarchy go way beyond just individuals and advertisers. Let's look at the political and corporate systems, because the shift here over the last few decades is staggering.
The foreword by Robert B. Reich provides highly illuminating data on this structural shift, specifically regarding corporate compensation.
The numbers are wild.
If you look at the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, CEOs of major companies made about 25 to 30 times the wages of a typical worker. But by 2007, just prior to the Great Recession, CEO pay packages had ballooned to about 350 times what the typical worker earned.
I want to make sure you, the listener, catch the specific comparison Reich uses here, because it blew my mind. In 1968, the CEO of General Motors, which was the powerhouse, the largest company in the U.S., at the time, made 66 times the pay of a typical GM worker.
Right.
Fast forward to 2005, the CEO of Walmart, which had taken over as the largest U.S. company, took home 900 times the pay of a typical Walmart worker. 900 times. So I have to ask, did the CEO of Walmart suddenly become 1,000 times smarter or more productive than the CEO of GM in the 60s? Or did they just get infinitely greedier?
Framing it as a sudden explosion of individual greed misses the structural shift. The
Hmm.
political economy and the institutional incentives fundamentally changed. Reich explains that 40 or 50 years ago, a large corporation resembled a civil service bureaucracy. Executives were essentially top bureaucrats.
They had to strike complex bargains with large, powerful labor unions. They had to negotiate with a government that heavily regulated them. And crucially, they needed public goodwill to operate smoothly.
Exactly. If a CEO in 1968 tried to take a salary that was 1,000 times higher than the factory floor worker, the union would have paralyzed the company, and the public would have been outraged. It was socially and politically untenable.
The environment did not permit that level of wealth pooling.
But as globalization accelerated, supply chains fragmented, and labor power was systematically weakened, the model of corporate leadership shifted. The CEO transitioned from being viewed as a top bureaucrat to being treated like a Hollywood celebrity or a star athlete.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you own a baseball team and there is one superstar hitter who can guarantee you a championship and sell out the stadium, you will pay them an astronomical sum, taking a massive share of the total team revenue, because they are viewed as the sole driver of that incremental advantage over your rivals.
Corporate boards began adopting this exact mentality. The system evolved to reward immense wealth pooling at the very top, fundamentally detaching executive success from the baseline prosperity of the workers who actually operate the company.
And politically, the system rewards this because politicians become dependent on elite donors and focus entirely on short-term macroeconomic growth narratives. They avoid discussions of redistribution because it threatens those elite interests.
So we have this massive structural distance being engineered at the top. The gaps are getting wider and wider. And how do our public institutions respond? They are incentivized to manage the downstream harm.
That is a crucial point. Instead of redesigning the upstream inequality that is generating the societal friction, our institutions are tasked with mopping up the damage. We expand healthcare systems to deal with stress-related illnesses. We expand policing to manage the friction and crime born of marginalized communities.
We hire more social workers. We treat the symptoms because challenging the design of the hierarchy itself is politically unpalatable.
Which brings us to the actual outcomes. Because the core claim of this research isn't just a philosophical argument about fairness, it is a data-driven epidemiological reality.
The authors of The Spirit Level looked at an immense amount of data across the 50 U.S. states, and they compared the rich, developed nations internationally, and the results are incredibly stark.
The pattern is undeniable. In rich countries, once you pass a certain baseline of economic development where absolute starvation is no longer the primary threat, further economic growth does not automatically buy you a healthier society. What dictates the health of the society is how that wealth is distributed.
Across the board, greater inequality predicts worse outcomes across almost every measurable health and social indicator.
We are talking about worse physical health, worse mental health, higher rates of violent crime, higher rates of illegal drug use, higher obesity rates, lower educational scores, and lower community trust.
It is almost a mathematical rule. If your society has a massive gap between the rich and the rest, your society is sicker.
But I want to dig into the mechanism here. How does a social concept like inequality actually get under your skin and give you a heart attack?
The mechanism is chronic status stress and how it ravages human biology. Let's look at how the body handles stress. When human beings experience an acute threat, say, an evolutionary scenario where you are running from a predator, your body brilliantly mobilizes resources.
It dumps glucose into your bloodstream for fast energy. Your blood vessels constrict to increase blood pressure and oxygen delivery to your muscles.
And it temporarily suppresses your immune system and your digestive system because fighting off a cold doesn't matter if you're about to be eaten.
Right. It's a perfect survival mechanism for a 10-minute sprint. But what happens when the threat isn't a predator, but the endless social evaluative threat we talked about earlier? What happens when you are constantly stressed about your status, your debt, your rank, and how you are perceived by the tribe for decades?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your body remains in a state of chronic mobilization, and that is catastrophic for your health. Chronic mobilization of glucose leads directly to central obesity and type 2 diabetes.
Chronic constriction of blood vessels leads to hypertension, arterial damage, and cardiovascular disease.
And a chronically suppressed immune system leaves you vulnerable to a host of pathogens and slows down cellular repair, accelerating aging.
And the most fascinating part of this data is that this stress doesn't just hit the people at the very bottom of the ladder. It diffuses through the entire social field. Even higher income groups experience worse health in unequal societies compared to their wealthy peers in more egalitarian societies.
To understand how deeply this permeates, we have to look at the famous Whitehall studies. This is perhaps one of the most revealing pieces of epidemiological research ever conducted. Researchers studied tens of thousands of British civil servants over decades.
And just to clarify for you listening, these are government workers. They all have stable, white-collar jobs. They are not living in absolute poverty. They aren't dealing with gang violence or homelessness. And importantly, they all have access to the exact same universal healthcare system in the UK.
So theoretically, their health outcomes should be fairly similar, right? You would assume so, especially since access to medical care was equalized.
The researchers initially thought that the executives at the very top, the people with the highest pressure jobs, making the biggest decisions, would be the ones suffering from stress-related illnesses, like the classic executive heart attack.
But the data showed the exact opposite.
The health gradient ran perfectly in line with the social gradient.
Perfectly in line. The high-ranking professionals, people doing very well, making good money, had worse health and shorter life expectancies than the senior executives just one step above them on the civil service ladder.
And the clerical staff, one step below those professionals, had worse health than they did.
And the messengers and porters at the bottom had the worst health of all. Every step down the social ladder correlated with a measurable decline in health and lifespan, even among people who were objectively middle class.
So it wasn't the demand of the job that was killing people. It was the lack of autonomy. It was the burden of subordination, the constant subtle reminders that you are lower in the hierarchy than the person down the hall.
It proves that the physiological wear and tear of status stress is relative, and it poisons the entire ecosystem. But the biological impact of this environment starts even earlier than the workplace. In fact, it starts before a person is even born.
Yes, the thrifty phenotype hypothesis. When I read this in the source material, I literally had to put the book down for a minute. It is staggering.
It really reframes everything.
Okay, so imagine a pregnant woman living in a highly unequal, high-stress environment. She is experiencing chronic social evaluative threat, financial strain, status anxiety. Her body is flooded with stress hormones like cortisol.
Those stress hormones cross the placenta. They actively signal to the developing fetus. The mother's biology is essentially sending a weather report to the unborn baby, telling it, you are about to be born into a harsh, dangerous, resource-scarce environment.
So what does the baby's body do? It adapts. It modifies its own development based on that epigenetic signal. The baby is born with a fundamentally slower metabolism, essentially preparing to survive a famine.
From an evolutionary standpoint, that is a brilliant life-saving adaptation. If the tribe is actually facing a famine, that baby will survive on fewer calories than a baby with a fast metabolism.
But here is the tragic mismatch. That baby is not born into a hunter-gatherer famine. That baby is born into a modern, highly unequal society that is absolutely flooded with cheap, calorie-dense, ultra-processed foods.
And because their metabolism was preemptively slowed down to survive starvation, their body hoards those calories. This biological adaptation to the mother's status stress leads directly to higher obesity rates later in life.
It is a profound demonstration of how the social environment literally shapes human biology. It completely dismantles the narrative that the obesity epidemic in poor demographics is simply a matter of weak willpower or poor choices. It is a biological response to an upstream structural design.
It changes everything about how you look at public health. But it's not just our bodies that are breaking down under this stress. It's the invisible fabric of society itself.
I'm talking about trust. Trust is a massive system variable here. The data shows that inequality absolutely eradicates mutual confidence between people.
The contrast in the international data is stark. If you look at the European and World Values Survey, you can measure generalized trust. Essentially, what percentage of the population agrees with the statement most people can be trusted?
And in highly egalitarian, high-trust societies like Sweden, that number is around 66%. Two-thirds of the population feels safe around strangers.
In Norway, it is entirely common to see cafes leave blankets out on the pavement chairs for customers to use if they get cold, with absolutely no fear that someone will steal them.
I can't even fathom that in most American cities. You leave a nice blanket on a chair outside overnight, it's gone in 10 minutes. And the data reflects that. If you look at high inequality, low trust environments, the numbers plummet. In Portugal, trust levels drop to 10%.
We can also look at specific microenvironments within the United States. New Orleans, for example, has historically been one of the most unequal large cities in the U.S. When Hurricane Katrina hit, the city faced a severe natural disaster.
But the post-disaster environment was famously characterized by intense mistrust, social fragmentation, and severe institutional breakdown.
Because when people are separated by vast material and social distances, empathy breaks down. You no longer see the other person across town as part of your in-group. You see them as an alien. You see them as a potential threat.
And when trust evaporates, friction increases, isolation increases, and the reliance on formal institutions like police and courts skyrockets because informal community bonds have dissolved.
And this brings us to a vital question for systems analysis. If this architecture causes so much biological and social damage, why does it persist? Why doesn't the system self-correct?
Because complex systems have reinforcing loops. They have feedback mechanisms that lock them into place even when they're actively harming the participants. Let's walk through the first of these vicious cycles. We can call it the consumer trap loop.
We begin with the initial condition. Structural inequality creates widespread status anxiety.
Right, so we feel insecure about our rank. That anxiety drives consumer signaling. We buy things we don't necessarily need, the upgraded car, the designer clothes, the larger house, just to keep up appearances and defend our status against social evaluative threat.
Which inevitably leads to environmental and financial strain. People take on massive consumer debt, they work longer hours to service that debt, they commute further from cheaper suburbs to maintain a certain standard of living.
And all of that stress, debt, and exhaustion causes social fragmentation. You are working too hard to pay for the car you bought to impress the neighbors, which means you have zero time to actually talk to your neighbors. You have less time for community involvement, less time for civic engagement.
Which results in weaker collective action. When a society is fragmented, isolated, and exhausted, labor unions lose their power. Community organizing falters. There is no unified political pressure to demand fairer wages or progressive taxation.
Which means policy stasis sets in. The laws don't change. The wealth keeps pooling at the top, and the inequality persists, starting the cycle all over again. It is a perfectly closed loop.
And if you want to understand how deeply entrenched this psychological trap is, we have to talk about the income experiment mentioned in the sources.
This is a revealing piece of behavioral economics. Researchers asked participants to choose between two hypothetical worlds.
In scenario A, you earn a certain income, say $50,000, but everyone else in your society earns $100,000. You are objectively comfortable, but relatively poor.
In scenario B, your real purchasing power is cut in half. You only earn $25,000, but everyone else earns $10,000. You are objectively poorer, but relatively rich.
And what is truly shocking is that 50% of the participants chose scenario B.
Half of the people surveyed were willing to trade away half of their actual material purchasing power just to secure a higher relative rank than their peers. They would rather be poorer in absolute terms as long as they could look down on their neighbors.
That is how powerful the drive for status is. It literally overrides rational economic self-interest. It perfectly illustrates why the system is so hard to dismantle. The psychological buy-in to the hierarchy is immense.
But there's a second reinforcing loop we must map out, and it is significantly darker. We can call it the punitive governance loop.
This loop starts with the same premise. Inequality reduces social trust. But when trust evaporates, it doesn't just make people lonely, it makes them combative.
The sociologist Robert Putnam measured this dynamic, and he used a great word for it, pugnacity.
Yes, pugnacity. Putnam found that in U.S. states with low social capital and low trust, which correlate tightly with high inequality, people are much readier for conflict. They are more likely to agree with statements like, "I'd do better than average in a fistfight."
The baseline level of hostility is elevated. People are predisposed to mayhem because they feel the environment demands it. They feel they have to be aggressively defensive.
And when you take that friction and put it in the most deprived, highly unequal neighborhoods, it turns lethal. The evolutionary psychologists Margot Wilson and Martin Daly did a profound study on neighborhoods in Chicago.
They looked at the homicide rates and compared them to life expectancies from other causes, like disease and poor health.
What they found was a chilling, direct correlation. The neighborhoods with the highest homicide rates were the exact same neighborhoods where life expectancies from nonviolent causes were the shortest.
Right, and the implication there is staggering. If you grow up in an environment where you subconsciously realize your life is going to be short anyway because of poor health, lack of health care, environmental toxins, and you have zero access to legitimate middle-class avenues of status like a prestigious college or a high-paying career, what do you do?
You don't just give up on status. You are human. You need status.
So you adopt reckless, high-risk, violent strategies to grab whatever short-term status and gratification you can right now.
The violence is not random. It is a tragically rational response to a steep hierarchy with blocked opportunities and a shortened time horizon. The system produces the violence.
But how does the state respond? Not by reducing the inequality. The state responds with more punitive governance. It responds to the friction by building more prisons.
Yeah.
It increases securitization. It militarizes the police.
It locks up response dramatically increases the stigma, the stress, and the trauma in those communities.
It removes parents from homes, destroying the economic base even further. This further lowers social cohesion and trust, ensuring the inequality, the friction, and the violence persist into the next generation.
It's a tragic cycle, and there's a really dark psychological mechanism for how people at the bottom process this stress on an individual level. It's sometimes called the bicycling reaction, where a person is bowing to their superiors while kicking down at their inferiors.
It's encapsulated in the Old English rhyme. The captain kicks the cabin boy and the cabin boy kicks the cat.
Downward prejudice. When people are marginalized and deprived of status by the system above them, they desperately try to regain a sense of worth by projecting prejudice downward. They find someone even more vulnerable, perhaps an immigrant group, with racial minority, or people on welfare, and they punch down.
It is a tragic psychological attempt to scrape back a tiny bit of superiority in a system that is crushing them. It pits the people suffering the most against each other, completely blinding them to the architecture above them.
Which brings us to the interconnection of these nested systems. The inequality hierarchy isn't just one problem among many. It is the central node connecting almost all of our societal dysfunctions.
If we look at public health and the mental burden on society, we see how these systems nest together. The source material features an index of illegal drug use compiled by the UN, tracking the use of opiates, cocaine, cannabis, and amphetamines.
The data clearly shows that the use of these drugs is significantly higher in more unequal countries.
And it isn't just because people have more money to buy drugs or because they are partying. It's self-medication. And there's an incredible animal study that illustrates exactly why this happens biologically.
Researchers took macaque monkeys, which are highly social primates like us, and housed them together in groups so that a social hierarchy naturally formed over time.
Some monkeys became the dominant high-status individuals, and others were relegated to being subordinate, low-status monkeys.
The researchers then scanned the brains of these monkeys. They found that the low-status monkeys had significantly lower levels of dopamine receptor activity. The chronic stress and subordination had essentially depressed their brain's reward system.
Life literally lost its joy for the monkeys at the bottom.
Precisely. Then, the researchers gave all the monkeys free access to cocaine. The results were illuminating. The low-status monkeys self-administered significantly more of the drug than the high-status monkeys.
They weren't partying, they were self-medicating.
Exactly. They were using chemical stimulants to artificially offset the biological dopamine deficit caused by their social subordination. If we extrapolate this to humans marginalized by steep hierarchies, it completely changes how we view addiction. Addiction is heavily mediated by the social environment dictating our biological reality.
We see the exact same interconnectedness in education and opportunity sorting. Inequality solidifies the social structure. If the rungs of the ladder are incredibly far apart, climbing them becomes impossible.
If you were born at the bottom in a highly unequal society, your chances of upward mobility are statistically dismal compared to more equal nations. The myth of equal opportunity breaks down.
And we see it in environmental sustainability. We talked about the consumer trap loop earlier, that desperate status-driven consumerism, the need to endlessly buy new clothes, new cars, new gadgets to defend your ego against social evaluative threat. That is exactly what drives ecological collapse.
The consumption is not driven by need, it is driven by status defense. We are quite literally consuming the planet's resources to manage our psychological anxiety about rank.
Now, recognizing these interconnected systems might feel overwhelming, but it actually allows us to see where the policy levers are. We aren't here today to prescribe a specific political manifesto, but we must acknowledge that policy tools do exist to reduce structural distance.
Historically, we have empirical proof that these tools work. Redistributive tax designs, the strengthening of labor power and collective bargaining, as we saw in the mid-20th century agreements between big business and unions, and the universal provisioning of basic needs.
These are structural levers. They have been pulled before, and when they were used to compress the income gap, they dramatically improved public health, increased social cohesion, and lengthened life expectancies. We must view them as mechanical adjustments to the system, not merely moral arguments.
We are looking at this structurally, not morally.
Exactly. Which brings us to the absolute climax of our deep dive today. I want you, the listener, to really think about everything we have mapped out: the biological stress, the destruction of trust, the sorting machines of our institutions. What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis in perception is a fundamental misdiagnosis of the reality around us. What is being misperceived is our constant reflexive framing of social breakdown. When we see a spike in violent crime, an epidemic of addiction, an obesity crisis, or failing schools, we frame these as individual moral failures. Or alternatively, we blame a vague, general cultural decay.
Right, we blame the parents, we blame a lack of discipline, we blame a loss of traditional values.
And in doing so, we remain completely blind to the structural layer that is obscured. We fail to see the massive, inequality-driven status system that operates quietly in the background. We are blind to the fact that this system is actively shaping our stress hormones, rewiring our brain chemistry, eroding our levels of mutual trust, and dictating our collective behavior at an immense scale.
Our surface-level interpretation fails entirely because it treats all these symptoms as if they are totally separate, isolated problems. We think we need a new drug policy for the addicts, better police tactics for the crime, and new diet guidelines for the obesity. We hire different experts to fight each fire.
But we fail to see them as coupled outputs of the exact same incentive environment. And that is exactly how systems-level analysis changes visibility. It forces us to stop staring at the downstream symptoms and start analyzing the upstream design.
It reveals that extreme inequality is not just a natural, inevitable byproduct of a free market, like the weather. It is an upstream design choice, and it is a choice that fundamentally reorganizes our institutions, degrades our relationships, and ultimately dictates our health outcomes and our life expectancies.
It is a heavy realization, but an incredibly empowering one. Because if it is a design choice, it means it can be redesigned. We are not trapped by nature, we are trapped by architecture.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. For centuries, philosophers like Thomas Hobbes told us that human beings are naturally competitive, selfish, and violent, that our default state is a war of all against all, and we require heavy, punitive governance just to survive each other.
That's the classic assumption.
But when anthropologists began studying early hunter-gatherer societies, the environment in which human biology actually evolved, they found something completely different. They found that these societies actively maintain equality through what they called vigilant sharing.
They intentionally formed alliances to prevent any single individual from dominating the group.
They actively policed equality because they understood that their survival depended on cooperation, not relentless competition. So here's the thought I want you to take with you. Consumerism, greed, and extreme individualism are not fixed, unavoidable aspects of human nature. They are simply the traits that our current, highly unequal environment actively selects for and rewards. If we change the structure of the environment, we literally change human nature.
That is the power of understanding the system.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.